Welcome back to our Ask the Agronomist video series. I am Phil Long, Precision Agronomy Advisor with Latham High-Tech Seeds, and today I'm going to be talking about a timely topic as we sit here on a nice cool fall day with manure applications, dry fertilizer applications going down, as well as many other fall activities going down, tillage and so forth. We're going to talk a little bit more about a particular area. The last few weeks we've been talking a lot about fertilizer and fertility and all the importance of that, and how we're dealing with high fertilizer prices this fall. But today I want to really focus in on those farmers that have fields that are either no-till or reduced-till fields, and those yield barriers that we run into on these fields, and particularly looking at pH management. So we've talked a lot about this in a previous video. But I want to focus on the differences that we see in no-till, because I see this a lot in many of those of you that no-till or have reduced tillage fields. You know, a lot of vertical tillage tools and other tillage tools that maybe only disturb the top few inches of soil, which is a great thing in terms of residue management. It helps size some of that, but also keep it there on the field, as well as managing it for next spring and helping us get into a little better planting conditions. But we wind up in a situation where we're not working the soil very deep, and we can end up with stratification, especially not only of nutrients, but especially pH. And typically, when it comes to soil sampling, we don't account for this. So it's one of the things I really want to focus on today and talk a little bit more about, and just remind everybody, you know, some of the reasons and the things they need to think about in these kind of situations. So when it comes to managing pH on no-till fields and doing lime applications, the first thing I usually think about is that growing crop in season. Where is it getting its nutrients from? So whether it's corn, soybeans, or really whatever crop it is, the majority of that root mass is in the very top part of the soil. And a lot of times the top few inches, especially if that's where most of the organic matter and most of the nutrients are coming from. That's where a majority of the root mass is going to be. In drought years, obviously, we hope that those roots go down further, but the majority of those root mass and where the nutrient uptake comes from is still in the top few inches. And in no-till situations, we can wind up in a very acidic situation in many areas where we're not doing tillage, but we have acidification, whether it's for putting down nitrogen fertilizers like urea or whatever the case is. There's a lot of things that can over time acidify the soil, and we can wind up in a tough spot. So if you have a pH, and if you have no-till fields and you're looking at a pH of 5.2, somewhere in there, that pH range there right alone is going to rob you of about 50 bushels of corn, and I usually figure about 25% on both corn and beans right off the bat. So well over probably $100 on either crop per acre, what you're going to be losing when you drop that pH down to that point. So we want to be able to manage that a little bit better, but the way we manage it typically is with a soil sample, and we pull a soil sample from that 0 to 6 inch. Well, when you're in a no-till situation, you're not mixing the soil that deep typically. No-till, you shouldn't be mixing the soil hardly at all, other than for planting applications. But if you're only mixing the soil in the top few inches, then that's really where your pH management or your soil sample should be coming from. So you got to remember where the majority of the root mass is taking up nutrients from, and then how much tillage is going on, because what we end up with is really acidic conditions that kind of puts not only the nutrients out of balance, but also puts our soil microbes at a disadvantage, which affects everything from nitrogen management, nitrogen uptake in corn and soybeans and their ability to fix nitrogen, as well as herbicide carryover and herbicide effectiveness. And there's just a whole list of things that keeping that pH in check really is going to help your farm and be more efficient and productive. So the first thing that we can do when looking at these situations is, number one, if you have a soil sample already that's 0 to 6 inches and you need to work with that, that's fine. Just keep a few things in mind. Number one, apply less more often is a good rule of thumb. So I would typically do it about twice as often, so maybe every couple years you probably should be applying lime. Because the one thing you need to remember when it comes to no-till soils is that lime movement in the soil is only about a half an inch per year. So a half an inch per year is not going to get you very far, even in 3, 4, or 5 years. So that's the advantage that having tillage has when it comes to mixing that and incorporating that lime application. So you're at a disadvantage with that, so you got to remember that it's going to be very slow moving, so you need to put it on more often. The other thing is, I typically don't like to see more than 4 tons of the acre go down. I would not be anywhere near that on a no-till situation, because what happens is if you're putting that much down, you're oversupplying it, you're not mixing it in the top part of the soil, so it's all going to be right there, and you're going to create a very basic situation that's going to cause issues with herbicides and everything for the next year or two of managing that farm. So if you have a soil sample that's 0 to 6, you can work with that. Just cut the rate in half, do it twice as often is really a good rule of thumb to go with. The next thing I would say, which is tough to say, I realize, but do some tillage. If it's long-term no-till, you're going to have to find ways and start applying, like I said, twice as often, half as much. But if you can do some tillage, that's going to be a huge advantage to you to get that pH corrected in the top part of that soil, get it fixed, and then go back to minimum till or no-till once you got that fixed. But just remember that it's going to take a whole lot longer to fix that in a no-till situation. That's why if you're considering going no-till, make sure that pH is fixed before you go into a no-till situation, because it's much harder to change that and much slower process to change that pH in the top part of the soil when you're not doing tillage. So the other thing I want to point out too is that we typically only see, when you're doing a lime application out there, you're only seeing, even if you're doing tillage, you're only seeing about 30% of it change your pH per year. So even if you have pretty much the perfect grind and it's 100% effective calcium carbonate, you're still going to only see about 33% of that work to reduce, or I should say raise your pH back up to where it is in a neutral, better neutralizing state per year. So remember that. It's going to take about 3 years for that line that you put out there to really work on getting your pH back up there. So if you take a soil sample this fall, realize it's acidic, you put some lime down, and then take another soil sample next fall, just remember that lime is not fully fixing what it will by the time it's done totally. The microbes are working on it and actually becoming fixing your soil pH. So just remember, it takes a few years to really see the full advantage of that lime that you're applying. And the last part of this, if you can, that I would highly encourage you, if you're especially if your whole farm is no-till or most of it's no-till, it might be a good idea to take some separate soil samples. So I have my soil probe here, and typically when we're taking, nope, fell out on me here, but typically when we're taking soil samples, now this is about a 6-inch core here. What you need to be doing in a no-till situation, if you're continuous no-till and have been no-till for a long time, you really need to cut that in half. Because when you're looking at that 0 to 6 and you're seeing maybe a 6.2 or a 6.5 pH, if you would look at the top 3 inches of soil instead, you would see probably where the pH really is, it's much more acidic. So it might be a 5 or even under a 5 in the top few inches, which would where a lot of that nutrients are coming from for your plant. But when you take a 0 to 6 and look at that as a whole over these type of fields and situations, it comes out to a more neutral pH, and then you don't realize that everything in that root zone in the top part is really struggling for maybe an unknown reason until you actually take the sample and realize that. So it'd be best to take that on the same system that you're taking now if you're on grids or whatnot, or zones, or however you're sampling. But even just to get an idea and understand what's going on out in the soil, it'd still be helpful to even just take that, just to kind of get a composite sample to understand how that pH is really stratified in the soil in a no-till situation. And then use that, obviously, that top part for your liming applications. And if it calls for a lot, obviously in a no-till situation, like I said, you don't want to be putting that much out there because you're not mixing it in the soil. It's going to take some time. So you need to do more lime applications, less amounts more often. So last, just to wrap up, The one thing I typically get asked is about gypsum. Gypsum is a great source of calcium. It does have some effects on the aggregate stability of the soil, so it's going to affect some of that structure and make it a little more airy, more loose and so forth. It can do that, but it's not a neutralizing product. It's calcium sulfate, so calcium is the part in a lime material. Calcium carbonate is what's raising that pH. Those carbonates and that calcium also helps, but the calcium is offset by the sulfur. So in a calcium sulfate, which is what gypsum is, or however you want to look at it, even the drywall in your house, that gypsum is calcium sulfate, and they offset each other. So they're not going to help raise or lower your pH. Sulfur will lower the pH if you have high pH, and the calcium will help raise it, but they're offsetting, so when it comes to gypsum, that's not going to help you in terms of pH management. Lastly, I just say the most important things about this really when it comes to no-till and managing your pH in a no-till situation is remembering where those roots grow, where the majority of them are pulling nutrients from, that narrow band really towards the surface where your organic matter and most of those nutrients accumulate is where that interchange is going to happen, and managing that pH is really critical to get that fertility balance in your soil, to make sure the plants can take up the nutrients that they should be taking up, and to really help, everything from herbicides and nitrogen management makes all of the other operations that you do on your farm much more effective. So and like I mentioned, this year, the drought that we had, if you have areas of lower pH, more acidic conditions, you likely saw that those areas struggled more on a yield map. You should be able to see that show up. Those areas are struggling. So just to finish up, obviously pH management, especially pH management on variable rate is extremely important. I don't recommend doing it any other way because it's extremely variable. When you look at your pH and the buffer pH of your soils, they're all going to be different. So if you spread a flat rate out there, when you get from those sandy knolls on top down to the heavy bottom spots, those are both going to require very different rates, even if they're at the same pH. So that's what that buffer pH means on your soil test. That's the ability of that soil to buffer the pH level. So remember, when it comes to that, the grid sample or managing it on a variable rate basis is really important, and that's what we focus on with our Data Forward program. And it all starts from that bottom. pH management really helps all the other nutrients and any other application down the road. So as always, we welcome any questions. Look forward to hearing from you on any of our social media platforms, or feel free to give us a call at 1-800-GO-LATHAM. Take care and have a good rest of the harvest.